He took a swing at a CID captain in a room full of witnesses, and he was face down on a steel table before his fist finished its arc. He never saw the dog move. That was the thing the witnesses all came back to later, in their statements, in the careful language of people describing something that happened faster than belief. 1 second the big loud man was on his feet, towering over the small woman across the table, his hand coming up and back. The next second there was 190 pounds of Doberman where the man's center of gravity used to be, and the man was bent over the table with his cheek against the cold steel and his arm locked up behind him in a grip that did not break the skin and did not let go. And a low sound was coming out of the dog that nobody in that room would ever forget. 4 seconds, start to finish. A coffee cup rolled off the table and shattered on the floor, and that was the loudest thing that happened, because the dog had done its work in near silence, and the man who'd been bragging about being a Navy SEAL 30 seconds earlier was now making a sound that had no bravado left in it at all. And the woman he'd swung at hadn't moved. She was still sitting exactly where she'd been, one hand half raised in a command she hadn't needed to finish giving. Her face as flat and calm and unbothered as it had been through the whole interview, looking at the man pinned across her table with an expression that was almost gentle. Like she'd been expecting this. Like she'd been waiting for it. Hold that picture. The pinned man, the silent dog, the calm captain with her hand in the air. Because I'm going to tell you how a routine supply theft investigation ended with a self-proclaimed SEAL face down on a table, and I'm going to tell you the thing none of those witnesses knew yet, which is that the man on the table wasn't a SEAL at all, and that the only one in the room who'd known it from the start had 4 legs and was still holding him down. Let me tell you who she was first. Captain Ada Rooke was an investigator with the Army's Criminal Investigation Division, and she was very good at a job that almost nobody understands. People think investigation is about evidence, about forensics, about the dramatic reveal, and sometimes it is. But mostly it's about people, and mostly it's about lies. And the whole craft of it comes down to one rare and quiet skill, the ability to sit across from someone who is lying to your face and stay completely, unshakably calm while they do it. Because liars need a reaction. A liar is running a performance, and a performance needs an audience that responds, that gets angry, gets intimidated, gets flustered, gives the liar something to push against and work with. The investigator who gives them nothing, who just sits there steady and patient and unmoved while the lie gets bigger and more desperate and starts to contradict itself, is the investigator who watches the whole thing come apart on its own. Ada Rooke had built her entire career on being the calmest person in every room she walked into. She had broken hardened men with nothing but a level gaze and a willingness to let silence do the work. She did not rattle. It was, you could say, her single greatest professional asset. The thing that made her dangerous in a way that loud men never saw coming, because she was small and quiet and they always mistook quiet for weak. And she had a dog. His name was Marshall, and he was a Doberman, lean and black and tan and built like something drawn by an engineer, and he was a certified protection dog, not a patrol dog, not a detection dog, but specifically a dog trained and tuned to read a threat to his handler and stop it. He sat beside Ada Rooke in every interview she ran, and most of the people across the table from her made the same mistake the SEAL was about to make, which was to look at the sleek dog sitting quietly at the captain's side and see an accessory, affectation, maybe an intimidation prop. They never understood what they were actually looking at. Marshall wasn't there for show, and he wasn't there mainly to intimidate. He was there because Ada Rooke's job involved sitting in small rooms with people who had every reason to want her investigation to stop, and Marshall's entire purpose in life was to be the half-second of warning and the 190 pounds of answer if one of them ever decided to make it stop the physical way. He read people the way she read people, except he read them lower and faster and with senses she didn't have, catching the tightening of a body, the shift of weight, the chemical change in a man's sweat when he moves from talking to doing, a few seconds before any of it became visible to a human eye. She'd gotten him, the way she got most things that mattered, sideways. Marshall had come out of a protection program with a write-up that called him over-attentive to handler, too bonded, too focused on the person he was protecting, not interested enough in the broader patrol work the program wanted. A washout, by their measure. To Ada Rooke, reading that file, it hadn't sounded like a flaw at all. It had sounded like exactly the dog she needed, an animal whose entire world organized itself around the safety of one person. She'd taken him, and the two of them had grown into the thing the loud man across the table was about to discover, which was a closed loop, a single instrument with two halves, the woman who read the lie and the dog who read the body, and between them there was almost nothing a man could hide and nothing he could try that they wouldn't see coming. There had been a day 2 years before that outpost, when Marshall had taught her exactly what he was worth, and she carried it with her into every room she ever entered afterward. It was a different case and a different man, a contractor under investigation for something uglier than theft, a man with a history of violence that the file hinted at and the man himself wore in the flat dead way he looked at people. Rooke had interviewed him in a civilian side office, alone but for Marshall, because the case was still quiet and the witnesses hadn't been arranged yet, and she'd thought going in that she had his measure. She'd been wrong a little in the one way that can get an investigator killed. She'd read him as cold and calculating, a manager of his own risk, a man who would never do anything as stupid as attacking a federal investigator in an office that knew he was there. And for most of the interview that Red held, he was controlled. He was careful. He gave her nothing. But there was a moment late in it when she got close to something, a date, a place, a body that had never been found, and she watched the careful control on his face stay exactly where it was, not flicker, not slip, the perfect mask of a man with real practice at hiding, and she thought in that moment that she'd hit nothing. Her own senses told her the man was calm, and she'd have moved on, would have let it go, would have missed the single most important tell of the entire case, except that beside her, Marshall had come up off the floor. Not all the way. Just up onto his feet, his body gone still and oriented, a low almost inaudible note starting in his chest, his dark eyes fixed on a man whose face was showing nothing at all. And Ada Rooke had learned by then, the lesson that became the spine of her whole career, that her own read of a person was the second best instrument in the room, and the dog was the first. Because the man's face was controlled, but the man's body was not. Somewhere under the mask, his heart rate had climbed and his sweat had changed and his weight had begun, fractionally, to gather, the deep animal preparation of a predator who has just decided that the woman across the desk knows too much to be allowed to leave. And Marshall had read every bit of that through senses she would never have, a full 10 or 15 seconds before any of it would have become visible to her, and he was telling her, in the only language he had, that the calm man was about to become a very dangerous one. She trusted the dog over her own eyes. She'd ended the interview right there, smoothly, without drama, gathered her things and stood, and the man had stood too, and for one held second the whole thing had balanced on a knife's edge, and Marshall had stepped between them, square and certain and loud now, every inch of him promising exactly what would happen if the man closed the distance. And the man had read that promise and done the math and let her walk out the door. They got him later, properly, with a team and a warrant and the body that interview had pointed them toward. But Ada Rooke never forgot that she'd been about to misread a killer as calm, and that a dog the program had thrown away for caring too much about his handler had stood up and corrected her, and very probably saved her life, while she was still congratulating herself on having the man figured out. That was the day the loop closed between them for good, the day she stopped thinking of Marshall as her protection and started thinking of him as her better set of senses, the partner who read the body while she read the words, two halves of one instrument that almost nothing got past. She never again sat across a table from a dangerous man and trusted only her own eyes. She watched the dog. The dog watched the truth. That was who walked into that outpost to close a supply theft case. And the man who decided to make her go away was exactly the kind of man who never, in his whole loud life, had the first idea what he was looking at. The case itself was not complicated, and that was part of what made it ugly. Over several months, a steady bleed of supplies had been walking out of that outpost's logistics chain. Fuel, parts, electronics, the kind of high-value, easy-to-move material that turns into money fast in the right markets. Somebody on the inside was moving it, and somebody on the inside was covering the paperwork, and the numbers had finally gotten big enough and sloppy enough that CID had sent someone to quietly pull the thread. They'd sent Ada Rooke. And the thread, when she pulled it, kept leading back toward one man. His name was Sergeant First Class Cole Bracken, and he ran a piece of that logistics operation, and he was, by every account, the loudest and most colorful personality on the whole outpost. He had a reputation. He told stories, big ones, war stories, operator stories, and the centerpiece of all of them was that Cole Bracken, before he'd ended up in a logistics billet, had been a Navy SEAL. He wore it like a crown. He had the haircut and the watch and the particular swagger, and he let everyone know constantly in 100 small ways that the man counting fuel drums had once been something far more dangerous, and that you'd be a fool to forget it. The young soldiers half-worshipped him. The officers gave him a wide berth. And when the quiet little CID captain showed up asking questions about missing supplies, Cole Bracken decided, with the total confidence of a man who had been getting away with things his whole life, that he was going to handle her the way he handled everything, by being the biggest, loudest, most intimidating thing in the room until the problem went away. He had no idea he was walking into the one kind of room where loud doesn't work. And he had no idea that the sleek, quiet dog at the captain's side had been reading men like him since before Cole Bracken ever started lying about who he was. The interview started civil enough, on the surface. Rooke had him brought to a small room, a couple of witnesses present by procedure, a junior investigator and a base legal officer in the corner, and she sat him down across a steel table, and she set a recorder between them, and Marshall lay down at her side with his head up and his dark eyes on the big man, and she began in her flat, calm, unhurried way to ask Cole Bracken about fuel. He didn't want to talk about fuel. Men like Bracken never want to talk about the small true thing. They want to talk about the big false thing, because the big false thing is where they live. So every question she asked about manifests and drum counts and signature logs, he answered with a story. She'd ask about a discrepancy in a transfer record and he'd wave it off and tell her about a night on some rooftop in a country he'd name with a knowing little pause, about the weight of the work he used to do, about how a man who'd carried what he'd carried didn't exactly sweat a paperwork mix-up. It was a technique, and it had clearly worked on people his whole life. The constant low reminder of the dangerous operator under the logistics sergeant, the implication threaded through everything that this was a man you did not want to push. He was managing her. Or he thought he was. Because Ada Rooke just sat there. She let him tell his stories. She didn't challenge them, didn't look impressed, didn't look unimpressed, gave him absolutely nothing to push against, just waited, calm as still water, and then asked the fuel question again. And again. And every time she came back to the small true thing instead of reacting to the big false thing, Bracken had to tell a slightly bigger story to fill the space her calm left open, and the story started very slightly to strain. Here is the thing about lying about being a SEAL to a CID investigator. It is one of the most documented, most verifiable claims a person can make. There is a record. There is a list. The community itself polices it ferociously. And Ada Rooke, before she ever sat down in that room, had done the most basic thing an investigator does, which is check, and Cole Bracken's name was on no list anywhere that it should have been. There was no Trident in his record. There was no record at all of the service he wore like a crown. The man telling rooftop stories to intimidate her had never been within 1,000 miles of the teams. He built an entire identity, an entire reputation, an entire shield, out of valor he had stolen from men who'd actually earned it, and he'd gotten away with it so completely, for so long, that he'd half come to believe it himself, the way the best liars do. She knew all of that walking in. And she said none of it. She just let him keep building, brick by bragging brick, the structure she was going to bring down on him whenever she chose, and she watched him strain, and she asked about fuel. You could feel the room change as it went on, even if you couldn't have said how. The two witnesses in the corner, the junior investigator and the legal officer, had come in expecting, probably, a routine and slightly tedious interview, the careful procedural circling that most of these things are. What they got instead was something closer to watching a current pull a swimmer who didn't yet know he was in trouble. Because the longer Bracken talked, the more the shape of it became visible to anyone paying attention. The captain wasn't chasing him. She was letting him run. Every time he flexed the operator thing, every time he reached for a bigger story to re-establish his footing, she simply absorbed it and came back, soft and flat and patient, to the small specific question he could not answer without indicting himself. The transfer that didn't reconcile, the signature that shouldn't exist, the drum count that walked. And each time she did, the gap between his enormous performance and her tiny relentless fact grew a little wider, and the room grew a little quieter, and Bracken had to spend a little more to fill it. He started to sweat. Not much, not visibly to most, but Marshall felt it, and the dog's posture changed by a degree, his head coming up a fraction, his attention sharpening on the big man in the way that, if you knew the dog, was the first page of a warning. Rooke felt it too, not the sweat but the dog, and she registered it the way she registered everything, without a flicker, and adjusted nothing, and asked about fuel again. She had been in enough of these rooms to know the rhythm of a man coming apart. First the stories get bigger. Then they get faster. Then they start to contradict each other, the small load-bearing details shifting between one telling and the next because there's no truth underneath to hold them in place. She'd seen it 100 times. She knew with the quiet certainty of a professional watching a familiar process unfold, that Cole Bracken was perhaps 10 minutes from saying the thing that would end him, and that all she had to do was stay exactly as calm as she already was and let him walk there on his own. What she didn't fully price in, what almost got her hurt, was that a man like Bracken, when he feels the floor going, doesn't always walk the quiet way to his ending. Some of them talk their way there. Some of them, the more dangerous ones, look for a shorter path. And underneath the swagger and the stolen stories, Cole Bracken had always, his whole life, been a man who solved problems he couldn't talk his way out of with his hands. That was the real thing under the fake seal, not an operator but a bully, and a bully who had just felt, for the first time in years, that intimidation wasn't working. It was a detail that finally cracked it open. A small one. He was deep into a story embroidering some operation, and he reached for a piece of jargon to make it sing. A term, a procedure, the kind of thing a man uses to prove he was there, and he got it wrong. Not subtly. He used it the way someone uses a word they've heard in movies but never lived, and to most of the people he told these stories to, it would have sailed right past. It did not sail past Ada Rooke, who had interviewed real operators across 100 cases and knew exactly how they talked about their work, which is to say almost never, and never like that. She didn't pounce on it. She just tilted her head a fraction, and let a small silence open up after his mistake, and held his eyes with that flat patient calm, long enough for him to hear his own words hanging in the air, long enough for the first thread of real fear to go through him, the specific fear of a liar who has just felt, for the first time, that the person across the table is not buying it and maybe never was. "That's not how that works," she said. Quietly. Not an accusation. Just a fact, set on the table between them. "Is it?" And that was the moment Cole Bracken understood that the small quiet woman with the dog was not going to be managed, had not been managed for 1 second of this entire interview, and had in fact been letting him dig his own hole the whole time. And a certain kind of man, when he feels the ground go out from under the lie he's lived inside for years, does not get quiet. He gets loud. He gets dangerous. The performance had failed, and the only thing Cole Bracken had left under the performance was the thing the performance had always been hiding, a cornered, frightened, violent man. He stood up. Fast, hard, the steel chair screeching back, using his size, 80 extra pounds and most of a foot of height, looming over the table down at her. The junior investigator in the corner started to rise. And Bracken leaned in over the table and put all the menace he had into his voice, the menace that had worked on frightened soldiers for years. "Let me tell you something, sweetheart. Low, ugly, close. I'm a Navy SEAL. You understand what that means. You and your little lapdog don't scare me, and you do not want to be the cop who came out here and tried to put this on me. So you're going to pack up your recorder and your purse dog and you're going to walk out of here, and we're going to forget you ever." She didn't pack up anything. She didn't even change expression. She just looked up at him, calm as ever, and said the thing that ended it. "You're not a SEAL, Sergeant. There's no Trident in your file. There's no record of any of it. A beat. And you're the one who's been moving the fuel." For 1 second, Cole Bracken's whole face came apart, the bragging mask, the operator swagger, all of it dropping away at once to show the cornered animal underneath, and the cornered animal did the thing cornered animals do. His hand came up and back, fast, all that size and rage behind it, swinging down at the small woman who had just taken everything from him with 4 flat sentences. He never landed it. Because Marshall, who had been lying at Ada Rooke's side reading Cole Bracken's body the entire interview, who had felt the man's weight shift and his sweat change and his whole frame load up to strike a full half-second before the hand ever moved, Marshall was already off the floor. He came up and across the table in a single fluid motion, no bark, no warning, none of the noise people expect from an attacking dog, because Marshall had not been trained to threaten. He had been trained to end things, and a threat is just a warning you give a problem you're hoping not to have to solve. Marshall wasn't hoping anything. He hit Cole Bracken at the shoulder with the full driving weight of his body, and he used the man's own forward momentum against him, and 190 pounds of furious certainty folded a much larger man down and forward until Bracken's face met the cold steel of the table with a sound like a dropped sandbag. And then Marshall simply held him there. He had the man's wrist and forearm in his jaws, the striking arm, the one that had been swinging at his handler, and the grip was a thing of terrible precision, hard enough that the man could not move it an inch, controlled enough that it did not break the skin, a grip that said with total clarity, I can end this whenever I am told to, and I have not been told to yet. And over the top of it came the sound, the low continuous rumble out of the dog's chest, not quite a growl, more a sustained note of absolute readiness, directed down into the ear of the man who had raised his hand to Ada Rooke. The whole room had gone rigid. The junior investigator was on his feet with his own hand half to his sidearm and nowhere to point it. The legal officer in the corner had pressed back against the wall. The recorder kept turning between the spilled coffee and the pinned man, capturing everything. And Cole Bracken, the SEAL, the operator, the most dangerous man on the outpost, was making a high thin sound against the tabletop and very carefully not moving, because every animal instinct he had left was telling him correctly that the thing on his arm would let him keep that arm only exactly as long as he stayed perfectly still. Ada Rooke still hadn't moved. She lowered the hand she'd half-raised, the command she hadn't needed to give, and she looked at the man pinned across her table with that same flat, almost gentle calm, and she let the moment sit for a beat 2-3, long enough for the witnesses to see clearly that the dog was in complete control and the captain was in no danger at all. Long enough to make a record of exactly who had attacked whom. Then she spoke, and her voice was as level as it had been when she was asking about fuel. He doesn't scare easy either, she said. You called him a lapdog. He's the only one in this room who read you right from the start. She let that land. Down means down, Sergeant. He'll hold you exactly that gently right up until you give him a reason not to. So I'd hold very still. And then because she was who she was, because the work was the work and a man assaulting her did not change the questions that still needed answering, she folded her hands on the table, glanced at the recorder to be sure it was running, and said, Now, about those missing crates. It would have been almost funny if it hadn't been so much the opposite. A man bent over a table with a Doberman's jaws around his arm, and the small woman across from him calmly resuming her interview. But that's exactly who Ada Rooke was, and it's exactly why she was so much more dangerous than Cole Bracken had ever understood. She didn't need him afraid. She'd never needed him afraid. She just needed the truth, and the truth was sitting right there on the table now, in the shape of a man who'd been so sure his stolen crown would protect him that he'd thrown a punch at a federal investigator with 2 witnesses and a running recorder in the room. The fight went out of Bracken all at once, the way it does when a man finally understands the full size of what he's done. He started talking. Not because of the dog only held his arm, but because the dog had stripped away the last thing he had, which was the performance, and a man with a performance gone is just a frightened person looking for the smallest exit he can find. He talked about the fuel. He talked about the parts, and the electronics, and the buyer off base, and the second man in the logistics office who'd been cooking the manifests, the whole quiet machine he'd been running for the better part of a year while everyone looked at the war hero and never thought to look at the thief. Rooke took it all calm, unhurried, asking her flat, clarifying questions, building the case in real time out of the wreckage of his bravado, while Marshall held his arm and the recorder turned. And the Trident, the stolen valor, the lie at the center of the whole man, came apart completely once the case did, because once you pull one thread on a person like that, the whole garment unravels. There had never been any teams. There had never been any rooftops, any operations, any of it. Cole Bracken had washed out of an entirely ordinary enlistment early in his career, drifted into logistics, and somewhere along the way discovered that a haircut, a watch, a swagger, and a few well-told lies could buy him a kind of authority and protection he'd never have earned honestly, that if you simply act like the most dangerous man in the room and dare everyone to question it. Most people won't. He'd built a whole life on the courage of men he'd never met. He'd used their valor to intimidate young soldiers, to skate on his job, to make a quiet little woman with a dog think twice about asking him hard questions. It had worked for years. It stopped working the day he tried it on the one investigator in the army who was constitutionally incapable of being intimidated, and her dog, who'd known from the moment Bracken sat down that the loud man's body was telling a different story than his mouth. The case, after that, was almost anticlimactic, the way real cases usually are once the central lie collapses. Bracken's confession in that room, given freely with 2 witnesses and a recorder running, opened every door. The second man in the logistics office, the one who'd been cooking the manifests, folded within a day of being shown what Bracken had already said. The off-base buyer got rolled up by the time the paperwork caught up to him. The whole quiet machine that had bled that outpost for the better part of a year came apart in under a week, because Ada Rooke had spent that year of stolen supplies worth of patience building a case so solid that all it had ever needed was for the man at the center of it to stop performing long enough to tell the truth, and a dog had arranged exactly that. The charges stacked up the way they do. The theft itself, a long, deliberate, large-dollar conspiracy, the kind of thing that ends careers and starts prison sentences. The assault on a federal investigator, captured start to finish on a recording, witnessed by 2 officers, with the added grim detail that he'd swung first and the dog had only responded. And then the other thing, the thing that in some ways the soldiers on that outpost took hardest of all, the stolen valor. Because when the truth came out, when it became known that the war hero they'd half-worshipped, the operator whose stories they'd repeated, had never served a day in any of it, had built his whole swaggering identity out of courage he'd stolen from men who'd bled for it, something curdled on that outpost that the theft alone never could have. You can almost forgive a thief. A thief is just weak. But a man who wraps himself in other men's valor to do it, who uses the honor of the dead and the wounded as a costume to intimidate and to steal, that's a different and colder kind of crime, and the young soldiers who'd looked up to Cole Bracken did not forgive it, and they were right not to. He went to a court-martial, and from there he went away for a long time, and his name became, on that outpost and in the tellings afterward, a particular kind of cautionary tale, not just about theft, but about the oldest lesson there is, which is that the man shouting the loudest about how dangerous he is very often the one hiding the most. I want to tell you the part that wasn't in the report. Because the report recorded the takedown, and the confession, and the charges, but it could not record the thing that actually made it possible, which was the years of quiet between a woman and a dog. Marshall had not done anything extraordinary that day, by his own measure. He had done the one thing he existed to do, read a threat to the person he loved, and end it before it landed, and he had done it exactly as trained, with exactly the control he'd been built to have, taking the striking arm and holding it and breaking nothing, because the difference between a protection dog and a weapon is precisely that control. The capacity to deliver overwhelming force and then govern it absolutely, to hold a violent man 1 careful millimeter short of harm, because that millimeter is the whole of the law and the whole of the training and the whole of the trust. That control isn't an accident, and it isn't only training either. It comes from the bond, from a dog so completely organized around one person's safety that he can be trusted to read her intentions as well as her enemies, to wait for her word, to know the difference between protect her and destroy him, and to live exactly on that line. The program that had washed Marshall out for being over-attentive to Handler had been looking at the very quality that made him, in the right hands, irreplaceable. Ada Rooke had read that washout file and seen not a flaw but a gift, the same way she saw through every loud man's performance to the small true thing underneath, and she'd been right, the way she was almost always right, because reading what's actually there underneath what everyone else sees was the whole of her particular genius. They promoted her, not long after. Major Ada Rooke. She'd have told you the case made itself, that she just sat in a room and let a liar talk, and that was true, and it was also the most dangerous skill in the building, and somebody up the chain was finally smart enough to see it. And Marshall became formally, what he'd always been in fact, an official protection asset of the office, written into the procedures, no longer something she'd had to half justify on a form, but a recognized part of how the work got done safely. The sleek, quiet dog that a thief had called a lapdog sat at the foot of a major's desk for years after that, reading every person who came through the door, and not one of them ever made the mistake Cole Bracken made, because the story had gotten around, the way the true ones do. She kept a small plate on her desk. Just a little engraved thing, the kind you could have made anywhere, and it sat where she could see it and where anyone across the desk from her could see it too, and it said 3 words that the people who knew the story understood and the people who didn't would ask about. Down means down. That was all. Down means down. It meant a dozen things at once. It was a command and a principle and a quiet warning, and a memory of a day a loud man learned all 3 at once over a steel table, and Ada Rooke never explained it to anybody's full satisfaction, which was very much her way. Marshall lived a long time, the loyal ones often do, and he spent the back half of it gray-muzzled and slower but never once off duty in his own mind, still lifting his head and reading every person who entered whatever room held Ada Rooke, still living organized entirely around the safety of one person, the way the program had marked him down for, the way she'd known to treasure. And at the very end of it, old and tired and finally allowed to rest, he slept beside her bed the way he'd lain beside her chair through 1,000 interviews, on watch to the last over the one person he'd been built, and washed out and chosen to protect. He'd read 100 liars across 100 tables and never once been fooled. But the truest thing he ever read was the simplest one, the one he'd known from the first day of a washed-out file, that the quiet woman who'd taken him when no one else wanted him was worth standing between and the whole rest of the world, every single time, no matter how loud it got. If you made it all the way through that interview with the 2 of them, do one small thing before you go. Down in the comments, tell me about a time the loudest, most intimidating person in the room turned out to be hiding the most. I read them. Every one. Because the quiet ones who see through the noise are exactly who this channel was built for. And if you believe that real strength almost never needs to announce itself, that the person calmly asking the hard questions is usually more dangerous than the man shouting over them, then subscribe and stay close, because next time we'll find another loud lie, and another quiet soul who sees right through it. Major Ada Rooke. And a dog named Marshall, who a thief once called a lapdog, the only one in the room who read him right, who took the striking arm and held it 1 careful inch short of harm, and who knew from a washed-out file to his very last breath, exactly who in this world was worth protecting. I'll see you in the next one.